today, Melissa and I and Dora, because this book is not only about me and George Washington, but Melissa, who is my traveling companion, and Dora, who is back there, also our traveling companion. Today we took 2 ferries. For a Nantucketer, that's a great day. We took the morning ferry to Hyannis, and we were driving along, and we thought, well, hey, why don't we take the ferry at New London and make it a twofer? So we did. It was great. We got here pretty close to the time. It got a little tense. That highway you have in the middle of this island is something. But it is great to be back here because Oyster Bay really served as kind of a historical nodal point for me and Melissa when we were traveling. This place features so much in the book, and I'm not going to go into the details yet because I'm going to save it. But it is just great to be here. Thank you, Harriet and Claire, who was also really big help. This Raynham Hall is just a terrific institution, and you guys are all so lucky to have them here. So that's a round of applause for Well, how did I come to write a book called Travels with George? I was finishing up my 3rd book about the American Revolution. A book that deals with the year of Yorktown, focusing on the naval battle that made the victory at Yorktown possible. And it was a late inning research trip to Providence, and I was in the John Brown house, which is not John Brown, the abolitionist, John Brown, one of the co-founders of Brown University, whose big magisterial home is owned by the Rhode Island Historical Society. And I was in there and wandered to the back where there's an annex, which includes John Brown's chariot. And in this chariot, John Brown reputedly took newly inaugurated President George Washington for a ride to Fox Point to see where he was building a ship named for the new president. And that got me to thinking, I knew Washington had been to Providence several times during the American Revolution. What was he doing there as president? And that led me to learn, as a sailor, I love the breeze. That is like a sail. Anyways, that got me to thinking, well, what was Washington doing? And when he became president in 1789, he was inaugurated on April 30th, 1789, the country was already divided. We think we have invented partisanship. That's an old concept in this country. It goes back to our very beginning. And what a lot of Americans don't realize, I think, today is that the Constitution deeply divided this country into those who were for the Constitution and a strong federal government, the Federalists, and those who distrusted the formation of a strong federal government, who believed that the state should retain the power that they had under the original Articles of Confederation. And these were known as the Anti-Federalists. There were no organized political parties as of yet, but when Washington was inaugurated, 2 states, North Carolina and pesky little Rhode Island, had not yet ratified the Constitution. They had not participated in Washington's election. So there was a political divide among the citizens already. And on top of that, there are regional differences. When the governor of Virginia said, "my country," he did not mean the United States of America. He meant Virginia. People were deeply thought of their town, their states, as their country. And the sense of a nation, including 13 former colonies, was a little hard for people to swallow. And so this was before the age of mass media, before Washington could get on the TV and make his thoughts known to the American people. He felt he had to go out there and visit as many villages and towns and cities in the country as possible, and prove to them that there was a new order now. There was the United States of America. So he went on a series of road trips. The temporary capital was New York. The first road trip was to New England. where he would be a month in the fall of 1789. That he had been president for not even 6 weeks, and he had it had a spectacular effect, as the newspaper in Salem would say. The arrival of the president has united all hearts in his favor, and believe me, before that was not necessarily the case. And after 8 years as president, as a commander of the Continental Army, Washington knew how to make an impression. Now remember, he was not in Air Force One making this journey. He was traveling in a horse-drawn carriage, 4 horses, with just about half a dozen people accompanying him. No security detail, just unimaginable in today's context. And he was trying to make an impression, but he also wanted people to think of him as one of them, as a citizen of the United States. So he insisted on staying in public taverns. He was not going to play favorites. He was not going to stay in the homes of his rich friends. He was going to stay in public taverns. Now today we think of a historic tavern as a great place for a B&B where you can have waffles in the morning, and it's terrific. In the late 18th century, public tavern was not anything special. It was the roadside motel of its day. The beds were terrible, the food worse. The only thing worse on his trip were the roads, which were just absolutely horrible. And it was a good thing TripAdvisor did not exist, because reading Washington's diary, and he kept a diary, it's just one continual lament about the inadequacies of the accommodations. But he also wanted to make an impression. This was a dancing act he was having between being one of the people and now your president. And this is the dancing act any president has 230 plus years later. And he knew how to make an impression because he had been commander-in-chief of the army for all those years. And so what he would often do as he came to the edge of a town is get out of the carriage, dressed in his general's uniform from the Revolutionary War, get on his great big white horse, and ride down Main Street to thunderous acclaim. If you've been to a modern-day political rally and you've seen the huge jumbotrons and the throbbing rock music, it all began with George Washington riding into town on a white horse. Well, the more I learned about this, the more I became intrigued. I have written, the book I was working on at that time was my 12th work of history. For the last 25 years, I live on Nantucket, along with Melissa and Dora, and I work in a basement office. And Nantucket, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the nautical center of the universe, and I developed improbable love of sailing. And as soon as I turned 16, I was car-topping my sunfish to races all over Pennsylvania and eventually the country. And I loved the racing, but the driving was also terrific. And after living for more than 30 years on Nantucket, where it takes approximately 25 minutes to drive from one end of the island to the other, I was getting a little itchy in terms of wanting to get out there and see the country I'd been writing about for all these years. And one of my favorite books of all time is John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, hence the title of this book. Hey, and John Steinbeck, a local Sag Harbor. Remember, Sag Harbor and Cold Spring Harbor, the two whaling towns in Long Island. And a lot of people don't realize that when Steinbeck was growing up in Monterey was a shore whaling station, and his father's best friend was a whaling captain. And so when he ended up in Sag Harbor, he was in many ways coming to a cultural home. And in fact, they had an annual Whalers Festival every September, and he was the chair for many years. To show you how seriously they took it, they had a huge styrofoam white whale that was powered by an outboard motor known as Mobile Dick. Steinbeck really embraced the whaling history. Well, I'll get back to the story, don't worry. But many years ago, there was a Steinbeck conference on Nantucket. And Steinbeck not only ended up in Sag Harbor, but he visited Nantucket. He was a great friend of Robert Benchley's, and he and his new wife, Elaine Steinbeck, spent the first summer of their marriage on Nantucket while he worked on East of Eden. And there was a Steinbeck and the Environment Conference on Nantucket in the early 1990s, and I gave a talk there, and attending this talk was none other than Elaine Steinbeck, who was then 78 years old, her first time back to Nantucket since that summer when she had just married John. And there was a reception at the Jared Coffin House, which is where significantly Melville stayed the summer after writing Moby Dick, if you can believe that. And Elaine was there, and everybody wanted to sit next to Elaine. And Melissa and I, being the locals, and I was not a Steinbeck scholar, the organizers decided rather than have a competition between the Steinbeck scholars, they put the locals on either side of Elaine. So we sat on either side of Elaine Steinbeck and got to talk to her about when John left Sag Harbor to drive across the country with Charlie, his standard poodle, to discover the meaning of America. As Elaine said, his health was terrible, but when he said he was bringing Charlie, I didn't worry about him. Mm-hmm. And so this book loomed large in our collective consciousness. And I thought, well, what if Melissa and we had just acquired a new puppy, Dora, who was then just a hyperactive, she is a Nova Scotia duck-tolling retriever. And hey, get this, 10 minutes ago, as we were walking around town, we came up on a 6-month-old duck-tolling retriever. I think only in Oyster Bay we did come across another duck-tolling retriever. Anyways, another aside. Getting back to where I was, and so we decided. I said, what if we followed Washington's journey across this country? He not only traveled in New England. His longest, most ambitious journey was the southern tour that would take him all the way to Savannah, Georgia, and then inland to Augusta, up to Charlotte, North Carolina, and eventually back to Philadelphia, which was then the temporary capital, the new temporary capital of the country, 2,000 miles. And so, what if we retrace this? And thus was born Travels with George. Now, one of the things that I found, both of us found very interesting, was, every town has a plaque that says George Washington was here. And what I wanted to do was to learn more than find the plaque and then move on. I wanted to know, we have Washington's diary. And so Washington was not the most interesting diarist. It's a selection of I went here, I went there. There are some interesting tidbits, but it's not Truman Capote revealing his soul. And so I decided I wanted to know what how was Washington remembered in these towns. On the New England tour alone, he visited 60 towns. We've all heard the historic joke, Washington slept here. It's spoken with a kind of a leer and ha ha ha. But the fact is, Washington slept in all these taverns because he was doing something very arduous. He was traveling the country along these terrible roads and these terrible taverns, trying to create a sense of nationhood. And so I thought, well, if Melissa and I are following Washington at this time of a deep partisan divide in this country, maybe we can get an interesting historical perspective on this country's divide by following Washington when he was trying to unite the United States at the very beginning of our history. And so, even before we headed out, I made a list of the towns he visited and reached out to as many of the libraries and historical societies, including Raynham Hall, as I could, and asked, what do you have about Washington? And soon I was getting pages from 19th century local histories. I was getting diaries and newspaper clippings, all sorts of stuff. And so what I began to realize that this was a book that was national in scope, but the real story behind this was very local. Tip O'Neill is remembered for saying all politics is local. Well, I am here before you today to say all history is local. Because if you're going to understand a national phenomenon such as Washington's journey across this country, you really have to look to how he was received in all of these places. Now, the New England tour was very important to Washington. He had a huge challenge as president. He realized that the colonial America had been absolutely dependent on the British for their imported goods, whether they were textiles, furniture, all of this stuff. There needed to be a technological and industrial revolution in this country if we were going to break our dependence on Britain. And it was in New England, particularly Massachusetts, where the tech revolution was already happening. There were all sorts of embryonic mills being formed. Many of them would only last a couple of years, but this was the beginning of what would spark the Industrial Revolution, particularly with the formation of Slater's Mill in Providence. Washington would do his New England tour, visiting these mills, making a point that this was where the future of America lay, but he didn't go to Rhode Island because pesky Rhode Island had not yet ratified the Constitution. And that he was going to wait. He was going to apply as much pressure as he could on that state. He does his tour of New England, and then he does something that is still curious today. He does the tour that, the reason we're here today, he does his tour of Western Long Island. Now, why would Washington come to Western Long Island? It would be in April of 1790. On all of his other tours, there was newspaper coverage of every minute of his tour, and the press was everywhere. When he came to Long Island, there is not a single story in any newspaper, including the New York newspapers, about his journey on Long Island. Clearly there was, when it came to the press, there was a blackout. What was going on here? Well, of course, as all of you know, being from this region of Long Island, this was the center of what was known as the Culper Spy Ring, the network that made possible, in many critical ways, the victory America had in the American Revolution, where there was information from Robert Townsend. This is his home as a kid. Posing as a loyalist on New York, information would make its way to Setauket, where it would then be picked up by an operative in a whaleboat at night, and then sailed across the Sound to Fairfield, where it would eventually make its way to Washington, who was headquartered on the Hudson River. And this is how he got the information he needed as he was doing his tactical back and forth with the British, who were dug in New York. And so when you look at where Washington went, it becomes pretty clear that he was visiting the places of where the spies had been or come from that were critical to this network. And of course, Oyster Bay was one of those places. He doesn't, the identities of these spies was still a secret, because if this experiment in republicanism, known as the U.S. of A., should fail and Great Britain would come back, you didn't want to know your identity as a spy to become public. And so, this was probably one of the reasons why there was no press coverage. Not even their own family members knew that they had been spies. It wouldn't be until the 1930s that those identities would become revealed by a historian. And so Washington was visiting these places. How he recognized these former spies was it a secret handshake? Was it some actual monetary? Who knows? But this was clearly what he was doing, and Oyster Bay and Cold Spring Harbor would figure large not only in Washington's tour, but in our tour, and largely because of the efforts of the good folks here at Raynham Hall. And I'd like to read a passage that will bring to your attention, I see, Phil Roosevelt. Good to see you, sir. Phil is in this passage, and I have to say, Phil and I attended the reenactment of Washington's April 30th inauguration at Federal Hall, right down there on Wall Street. And that was something, wasn't it? It really was incredible. Talk about channeling the past. And there's an element of absurdity in any reenactment, and yet it's the history that they are reenacting that redeems all and makes it something truly, truly special. All right, so from Travels with George. When Washington visited Cold Spring Harbor in April 1790, an 8-year-old girl named Sarah was standing at her father's gate. 88 years later, in 1878, 88 years later, the now 96-year-old Sarah Mead, then living in Greenwich Village, talked to a reporter about the time the president visited Cold Spring Village on Long Island. Imagine it. Not only had Sarah seen George Washington, but she had lived through the War of 1812, the Gold Rush, the Civil War, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn, not to mention the nation's centennial. Sarah remembered seeing Washington coming up the road mounted on a large horse. Right next to Sarah's house, workers were in the midst of building a one-room schoolhouse, the Bonetown School, which Claire showed us the plaque of where it was, now a Congregational church, Episcopal church? Yeah. As Washington approached the construction site, and remember, Washington was 6 foot 4 inches tall, a giant in the late 18th century. As Washington approached the construction site, he called on everyone in his entourage to give 3 cheers for the new school. He then dismounted from his horse, Sarah recalled, assisted in raising one of the rafters, and left $1 wherewith to treat the men. Yes, Washington was enjoying himself during his tour of Long Island. Oyster Bay was the home of Washington's most important informant during the Revolution, Robert Townsend, a.k.a. Culper Jr., who posed as a loyalist merchant in New York City while sending Washington a regular stream of messages via the courier Austin Rowe. Townsend grew up at Raynham Hall, now Historic House Museum in Oyster Bay. The museum's historian Claire Bellerjou showed us the family plot where Robert was buried. When he died in 1838 at the age of 84, not even Townsend's family members knew of his spying activities. Instead of staying with the Townsends at Raynham Hall, Washington spent his one night in Oyster Bay at the home of Daniel Youngs, a loyalist during the war who served as a forage captain for the British Army. The question is why, especially given Robert Townsend's pivotal role in the Culper spy ring. To help answer that question, I turned to Phil Roosevelt, the editorial director at Barron's Magazine, whom I had met several years before when he attended a Moby Dick marathon read on Nantucket. Now remember, this was in February, I think it was, and there was snow on Nantucket. There was no one on the island except for year-rounders and Phil. Phil, it turned out, had grown up not just in Oyster Bay, also home to his kinsman, President Theodore Roosevelt, but in the very same house in which Washington slept on April 23rd, 1790. Phil said that his father always insisted the home's owner, at the time of the president's visit, had really been a spy during the war. That's also what Morton Pennypacker, the first researcher to identify the members of the Culper spy ring, claimed, pointing to Daniel Young's lackluster performance as a forager for the British Army as indirect proof. Apparently, Youngs did such a terrible job of rounding up hay that he was regularly admonished by his superiors. But as Phil points out, there's no direct proof whatsoever that Youngs was a Patriot informant. Phil's theory is that by staying at Young's house, Washington was making a point about forgiveness. Now that the war was over, it was time for all Americans, Federalists, Anti-Federalists, and even former Loyalists, to stand united. I asked Phil what it was like growing up in a house like this. He said people would sometimes knock on the front door and expect to be given a tour. Every now and then, Phil would actually show them around. By that point, the room in which Washington had stayed had been turned into a bathroom. Phil was then in middle school, a time in life when anything associated with bodily functions is hilarious. Phil said he took great delight in showing his unsuspecting victims the bathroom and saying with great authority, "Washington slept here." Thank you. Yes, thank you, Phil. That was the best anecdote in the book, I think. No, but and then you get a taste for what this book is. I think historians can take themselves way too seriously. There's just too much absurdity in life to look back on the past without a cocked eyebrow and at least a little bit of a smirk every now and then. And Washington, for one, had a great sense of humor. He was not a backslapper. He was not staid. He was, staid and remote. There was a sense of familiarity in terms of his real personality and what we see on the $1 bill. But as you heard here, there, in Cold Spring Harbor, he was having a good time out here on the road. And one of the things I think people don't realize is Washington almost died during the first 2 years of his presidency. This is a man for whom travel had been a part of his life ever since he was a teenager, when he became a surveyor and was traveling through the wilds of western Virginia and western Pennsylvania. Then he became an officer, a provincial officer in the British Army during the 7 Years' War, once again traveling immense distances. And then during the Revolution, he crisscrossed the country. It was a 500-mile march from New York to Yorktown that would ultimately seal the deal. And even when he was a plantation owner, he was always on horseback, often 6 hours a day inspecting the 8,000 acres of Mount Vernon. And so this was a guy for whom travel was just built into the very fiber of his being. And when he became president, suddenly that stopped. And there were immense pressures. Now he was creating the office of the presidency. And I think we have a tendency to give Washington, to think that Washington had it figured out from the first, and that he was guided by an immense sense of my way will ultimately prevail. That's not the case at all. He knew he was on the edge of a precipice when he became president of the United States. There's direct evidence that he was pretty much terrified during the inauguration. At one point, he fell back and landed in his chair, and everybody stopped saying anything before he took the oath of office. This is a guy who realized that all of the partisanship we're experiencing today was latently existed in the country and was going to come back at some point in his presidency, as it would. And so, there are immense pressures for trying to create a new country out of these 13 rebellious states that had a history of rebellion when it came to taxation. How was he going to create a federal government that taxed these people who had, were willing to fight the strongest military power on earth over the issue of whether or not they were taxed? And so, immense pressures. And within a month of his presidency, he comes down with an illness that almost kills him. Just after he comes to Long Island, he gets the flu, nearly dies again. He was despaired of. He developed these hiccups and horrible death rattle that Martha was convinced was the end of him. Somehow, eventually his fever broke and he survived, but it would be months before he could exercise in any kind of way. And so he began to realize that the presidency might very well kill him. And yet these trips that he was taking to see the American people might be what saved him, because it would get him out of the office. And so I think these tours of America saved this country, and in a very real way saved George Washington. Now, one of the things I wanted to get at with this book was now, Washington was not talking about slavery during these tours of the country. He knew slavery was, if this was brought, by this time, Washington's attitude towards slavery had changed a great deal. And one of the things I want people who read this book to is to realize how far Washington traveled, not just in terms of miles across this country, but as a human being. This is a guy who became a slaveholder at age 11 when his father died, and he inherited several enslaved people. But the revolution would change him. He would befriend Lafayette, the young idealistic Frenchman who would later declare that if he knew he was helping to form a country of slavery, he would never have lifted his sword in the cause of America. And Washington and Lafayette remained friends for the rest of Lafayette's life. Washington, as president, would be overheard, and this would be recorded by Jefferson, saying that if slavery should divide this country, he would go to the northern part, which is an extraordinary statement from a Virginian. When he died, he would free his enslaved workers, the only slave-owning founding father to do so. And yet, with Washington, as with any historical figure, there are paradoxes. In the year that he was drawing up that will that would free his enslaved workers, he was actively pursuing Ona Judge, Martha Washington's enslaved house servant, who had escaped into the streets of Philadelphia and got her way by schooner to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where she became effectively free. Washington would hear that she had learned that that's where she was, and in the final year of his life, he would direct Martha's nephew, Burrell Bassett, to try to bring her back. His second effort to do that, so how could Washington, who had come to realize that slavery would be the downfall of the Union ultimately, how could he rationalize help? And one thing to realize, there were 300 enslaved workers in Mount Vernon, approximately. Half of them were owned by Washington, half of them were the property of Martha's deceased husband's estate that had been willed to their grandchildren. And so Washington could not technically free them. And so it was a very complicated situation in Mount Vernon. And yet when Washington died and those enslaved workers were freed, they would become the core of a free black community in Fairfax County that would create a society and culture unlike anything else in the South prior to the Civil War. This was more than a symbolic act on Washington's part. And I think, Washington does not get an out-of-jail card when it comes to slavery by any means, but he believed with all his soul in the Union, and it would be the Union that would move Lincoln 75 years later to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And so with this book, this was an issue I needed to grapple with, just as Washington was grappling with it. And Washington was remarkable in that he grew to doubt many of the preconceptions of the society he grew up in. That he was unable to free himself from all those preconceptions, I don't think negates what he was able to achieve when it comes to the creation of this country. Now, Washington's Southern tour was different from all the others. By that time, the policies of his government were coming into clearer focus. By that time, Thomas Jefferson was his Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton was his Treasury Secretary. And the two cabinet members did not see eye to eye. Alexander Hamilton believed in that strong federal government, believed in a national bank, which Thomas Jefferson believed to be unconstitutional. Washington would support Hamilton. And by the time of his Southern tour, Hamilton had shepherded through Congress a new tax on whiskey that in a few years' time would instigate the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania. And it looked like the South was going to be exactly the same had the same kind of response. There was the former governor of North Carolina, Wiley Jones, had said, "I have great esteem for General Washington, but will not allow President Washington into my house." There were towns in the interior of South Carolina that had issued proclamations disavowing the tax on whiskey, saying it was something that unfairly taxed them. And so Washington was not going to just be feted as he made his way through the South. He was also going to have to sell his policies. And there was something known as the Washington effect, at least that's how I coined it. Everywhere he went, he said when he talked to people who did not agree with his policies, he said once he did his best to explain them, they would begin to see the light as he saw it. Now this may have been whistling in the dark, but I think there's some truth to it. Because unlike Western Pennsylvania, there would be no insurrections in the South, even though there were all the earmarks of a similar reaction. And so Washington's Southern tour was a very important part of the series of tours. Now, by this time, Washington's Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, is very angry with Hamilton. If you've seen Hamilton, you know the plot. And with the help of James Madison, begins to organize the political resistance. As Washington's finishing up his Southern tour, Jefferson and Madison leave on their own Northern tour to the new state of Vermont. And Jefferson would write Washington saying, "This is for my health." What he would not say is that they would meet with anti-federalists such as Aaron Burr and begin to organize what would become the Republican Party. And by Washington's second term, which he agreed to take on very reluctantly, partisanship would be just as bad as it is today, if not worse, in terms of personal attacks. And Washington would die very upset about the divide that had taken over this country. So I don't think if he came back today, he would be surprised by the divisions we have. I think what would upset him are our attempts today to undermine our faith in the laws of this land, our faith in a federal government that is working on our behalf. Because if you do that, you kick out from underneath this country the very premise on which a republic is based. And so I think that would deeply upset Washington. Now, I would like to finish today by reading a section from the epilogue. Because once we had finished following Washington's travels, Melissa and I embarked on a final tour following Jefferson and Madison into Vermont. And my brother Sam and I grew up summers on Mount Mansfield in a camp about 20 miles from Lake Champlain. And it was going up. Jefferson and Madison were on a vessel sailing up Lake Champlain, trying to get to Burlington when the northerly winds eventually turned them back. But Sam and I and Melissa and Sam's wife Sue and Dora went to the top of Mount Mansfield to take a look. And this is where this passage begins. And this is where I will end. Standing on Mount Mansfield at the end of summer, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. Our travels with George had come to an end, just as the story of the new nation was beginning. Jefferson and Madison would return to Philadelphia and continue to organize the political resistance, confident they were battling the pernicious forces of monarchy and corruption. In the meantime, Hamilton and the Federalists, equally confident in their righteousness, pushed forward the financial programs on which today's economy, with all its excesses and inequalities, is built. In the middle was Washington, a Federalist for sure, but a Federalist who recognized there was another point of view. What bothered him were not the philosophical differences between his two warring cabinet members, but their unwillingness to work cooperatively. Differences in political opinions are as unavoidable as to a certain point they may perhaps be necessary, he wrote to Hamilton. When matters get to such lengths, the natural inference is that both sides have strained the cords beyond their bearing, and that a middle course would be found the best until experience shall have pointed out the right mode, or, which is not to be expected because it is denied to mortals, there shall be some infallible rule by which we could forejudge events. What both Hamilton and Jefferson needed, Washington seemed to be saying, was a little more humility and self-doubt. Because no one, not even the two most brilliant men of their age, had all the answers. Unlike Hamilton and Jefferson, Washington didn't need to be right all the time. He just wanted to make things work. He understood that feasible change is not attained by righteous indignation. It's understanding that the road ahead is full of compromises if life is actually going to get better. Not Jefferson. When it came to his beloved French Revolution, he insisted that rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but an Adam and Eve left in every country and left free, it would be better than it is now. This kind of philosophical dogmatism and melodrama was anathema to Washington. He had spent 8 years of his life doing his best to prevent the United States from succumbing to the divisions and violence that were about to consume France. He understood the darkness of self-interest lurking beneath the most high-minded ideals, and yet, despite his inherent skepticism concerning the human condition, he had an abiding faith in the American people. Although we may be a little wrong now and then, Washington wrote to his former aide-de-camp, Jonathan Trumbull, Jr., we shall return to the right path with more avidity. Thomas Jefferson had written the Declaration of Independence, but it had been left to George Washington to translate its words into something real, into something that might one day evolve into what the preamble to the Constitution calls a more perfect union. By subsuming sectional and philosophical interests to the good of the whole, the Union is the antidote to arrogance and self-importance, because there will always be something bigger than a single person, town, city, state, or region, or any single race, religion, sexual orientation, or set of beliefs. The founders never claimed to have created the ideal political system, but no one, over the course of the last 244 years, has come up with a better form of government. The fact that we are in a position today to find fault with the past is a tribute to what was created by the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the labors of George Washington. If our country is ever going to improve in the future, we need to look the past full in the face today, and there at the very beginning is our first president, a slaveholder, a land baron, a general, and a politician who believed with all his soul in the Union. Thank you very much.